Executive Director of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, or ICAB. Before we start the webinar, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items so you will know how to participate. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop. Please note, if anyone is having problems with their audio, they should hover over the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen to make the toolbar visible. If you see then Join Audio, the Join Audio icon on the extreme left-hand corner of the screen, it means that you have not connected to your audio. Click the audio headset icon and then click Join by Computer Audio to join to connect to the audio. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to the presenters, either by typing your questions in the question and answer pane of the control panel, or you may raise your hand to be unmuted for verbal questions. Please note that you may send in your questions at any time during the panel discussion. We will collect the questions and address them. If you have any technical challenges, you may type your challenge or query in the chat or email admin@icab.bb. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Derek Osborne. Derek is a partner and senior actuary in the international practice of LifeWorks. LifeWorks is the largest company in Canada offering business resources, human resources consulting and outsourcing services. Derek holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics with a major in actuarial science and a minor in economics from the University of Waterloo, Canada. He is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries and a past president of the Caribbean Actuarial Association. He has over 25 years experience in Social Security and pensions in the Caribbean and has advised most of the Social Security funds in the English-speaking Caribbean. Derek is a consulting actuary to the NIS. Then have Charles Herbert. Charles spent most of his working life as an actuary, working primarily in the pension industry in Barbados and the wider Caribbean. He worked first with the Barbados Mutual and then opened a branch of Eckler Limited in Barbados in 1995. He retired from actuarial work in 2017, but continues to be active as chair of Goddard Enterprises and as a farmer producing the well-known Redland lettuce. He is a past president of the Caribbean Actuarial Association and a former chairman of the Barbados Private Sector Association. And then we have Gregory Hinkson. Gregory is the principal consultant and managing director of Samdor Services Limited. Samdor Services Limited is an independent boutique financial services firm specializing in investment and financial advisory services, particularly pensions. Gregory was the vice president investments with a regional insurance company. He also previously served as manager investments with the National Insurance Department of Barbados. Gregory is a member of the Chartered Professional Accountants, or CPA, of British Columbia and is a fellow of ICAB. He's also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Gregory is currently the chairman of the Barbados Diocesan Trustees and chairman of the Diocesan Pensions Board. He is also a trustee and chairman of the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry Pension Plan. And as our moderator, we have David Ellis, who I'm sure needs no introduction to you. So over to you, David.
Well, good evening and welcome to this discussion. As you already know, there have been some town hall meetings and people have been giving their views in other fora as well, as it relates to the future and the threat to the National Insurance Scheme if we take no action at this time. In other words, as it has been put, if we kick the can down the road. You represent one of the most important constituencies that this country ought to hear from as we look at the way forward, given the profession that you are in. And therefore, this evening, we hope that we can hear from you, your own thoughts on especially those options which have been outlined to the public by the actuary and others who are associated with this national insurance scheme in Barbados. And that's exactly where we are going to start. We're going to have each of the main participants speak for about 5 minutes. We hope we can restrict it to that. But as much as possible, we want to get your input this evening. So let's come first of all to Derek Osborne, who's been doing quite a lot of talking. And I'm sure that we're going to be asking him to repeat much of what he's said so far. But the most important issue that I think you need to put before the members of ICAB this evening is the options available to us right now and what has brought us there. Good evening.
Good evening, David, and good evening to everybody who's on the webinar tonight. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to ICAB for inviting me. So I'm sure everybody has heard the main headlines from the actuarial review. It's a 3-year cycle. These reviews are done, and they are pretty much on schedule. And this time around, the future is not as bright as it looked before. The projection is now that the fund, if nothing is done, would be depleted between 2034 and 2041. Now, first of all, a depletion of NIS fund does not mean no more NIS. Right? NIS will still be able to collect contributions and pay benefits to the extent they have enough money to pay benefits. The challenge we really have, if we look forward, is filling the gap between what comes in contribution and what goes out in benefits. That gap is already about $200 million a year and getting larger each year. So the options have been discussed, and for any pension plan, if you want to make a pension plan less costly for the future, there are really only 2 things that you can do. One is to have, well, 2 practical things. We won't discuss killing people at age 95 or age 90. That's not on the table. One would be to reduce the average new pension. So instead of $1,000, maybe average new pension, make it $950 or $960 or $970, a little bit smaller. And the other one would be to start pensions a little bit later. So each person maybe 6 months later, 12 months later than would have ordinarily been the case. But in making pensions smaller, there are many options within that. We can look at targeting higher income people so that they get a little bit less, more or less than the one to the lower income. In Barbados today, the minimum pension is very high already. It's quite high, at just over $1,000 per month. 40% of new pensions are getting minimum pensions, which means that the pension formula, when calculated, gives an amount less than $1,000 a month, and therefore it's bumped up to the $1,000 a month. So the options, we can also get a new structure. So NIS is 55 years old. It was designed with the ILO type system back in the 1960s. And nothing has changed really much with the design. Barbados has evolved. The population is aging. It's actually declining as we speak. Labor market is declining. Workforce is changing. A lot more people in the gig economy, self-employed, informal sector. And so it could also mean a change for the structure of the NIS. And we can discuss that later if we have time. So there are what we believe are 4 ingredients for a sustainable NIS. And the first one is economy. One of the reasons why the projections keep getting more and more, pessimistic is the starting point each successive review, that the economy has been sluggish, growth rates have been low, or for the most part negative. We have fewer employees today than we had 15, 20 years ago. NIS contributors are down. And the way the scheme is funded, yes, there are over $4 billion in assets, but there's a need to collect contributions from current workers to help pay the benefits of current pensioners. And so the outlook is not that good. And the number one ingredient we believe is the economy, a healthy growing economy. The second one is design. As I mentioned a while ago, 55-year-old system, life has changed in Barbados. NIS really has not changed much in its design. That's number 2. The third one is systems. COVID has helped many industries improve the way they do things and how they serve their customers. NIS needs to get better at systems and linking with other government departments to ensure that that collections are made on time and that they're complete, and also to meet self-employed people where they are. And the fourth ingredient is what we call honest and responsible government. And all that means is that we want the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, the ministers, NIS leaders, the director and her team to be proactive right? To pay attention to what's happening, to provide good governance where, as expected from a public sector entity, and by so doing, to improve the confidence of the population, contributors, employers, so that when times like today come, and it's time for us to make some tough decisions, that we can, come together collectively and find a Barbados solution for this Barbados problem. I'll pause there, David, and I'll hand over.
Yes, but before we go on to someone else, this question of changing the structure of NIS, what exactly are we suggesting here?
So there are several options. Other countries around the world have done different things. The NIS today is what we call a defined benefit system, where there's a formula that dictates how much you get when it's your turn to get. There are other systems who have gone to a defined contribution approach, where essentially each person has an account, and the more you put in, as the more you get back with investment earnings. There are other systems in place where some countries have a flat benefit just because you're old. So regardless of your contribution history, just because you're, it could be 67, could be 70, there's a flat benefit paid to everybody. It could be means tested. So we actually save some money from giving that benefit to people who may not necessarily need it. And then maybe have a smaller NIS. Okay, so I'll stop. So they're different. Some countries have a notional defined contribution, which is not fully funded, but again, it's just a notional account. So there's several things that we can look at. And as we've heard in the last few weeks, everything is generally on the table. There have been no decisions made yet. And so the consultations are still open, and ideas from the public. And the priority is that the Barbadians feel about the NIS will help drive the solution.
My question is, though, the method that is being employed right now to get public reaction, how much feedback can you get on the nitty-gritty issues here that you put before us? This issue of changing the structure of the NIS and stuff. I've listened to the public fora and stuff, but people have spoken about other things. To what extent are you getting the kind of feedback that you need on how exactly are we going to address this issue of changing the structure?
Right. So from a design standpoint, you start off with your objectives, what you're trying to achieve. And we believe that from the town halls that we've had, from the online responses by email, from the survey that's now open, we have a good idea as to what's important to Barbadians, whether it be the age remaining 67 or whether the contribution rate remaining where it is, and so on. We also know that Barbadians value their NIS, and that the minimum pension right now seems to be adequate. So the goal now is to take that feedback, look at the priorities, and then we see how we can fine-tune the system, whether it be a tweak of the current structure, or whether it be a whole overhaul or a half overhaul of the, and do something different to see what structure or what tweaking best suits what we're trying to achieve, whether it be contributions regularly from self-employed people, whether it be a target benefit where it's means tested, whether it be progressive, where we have lower income people get proportionally more, or it could also be a career average. Right now, we use a 5-year average best earnings. A career average gives you a better link between contributions and benefits. There are options.
Now, Charles Herbert, as an actuary yourself, how do you see these options and the challenges confronting the NIS?
David, I think Derek is right, and we can't stray too far from the key issues of adjusting benefits and contributions. Ultimately, there are the decisions that we can't get away from. And there's been a lot of noise in the discussion because people are instead talking about the fund and the money that's lost from the fund and the governance of the fund and so on. And I don't think we can get away from those subjects either, because the way that this has been brought to the public has made people lose confidence in national insurance. And I think regaining that confidence is going to be critical. because there's no doubt that one of the key issues is that our contributors have fallen from 130,000 to 110,000 in rough numbers. Personally, I don't believe that our workforce has dropped by that amount. And what it would seem to have happened is that a large number of people are either transferring from the employer workforce to the self-employed workforce. And in the self-employed workforce, they legally don't have the election to not contribute, but they are not contributing. They're falling below the scheme. And a huge solution to this problem is to capture, or I won't even say recapture, because even when we had those 20,000, we didn't have all of them. But the whole thing is, and I'm sure I see Derek nodding, if suddenly 40,000 self-employed people decided to get on board and contribute to this scheme, then the need for solutions, or the level of solutions that we would need, would dramatically change. So I think in this discussion, we can't avoid what Derek is saying about the adjustments to benefits, and some of that should happen anyway. But a big part of the discussion has to be, how do we get the self-employed people on board? And what worries me is that Barbados has national census and surveys, and we need to bring a lot more information to the table. Where have these people dropped out of the, I don't know what information National Insurance keeps, but where have these 20,000 people disappeared from? Is it one particular industry that has suddenly stopped employing people and instead employs them on contract where they're self-employed? We need to understand, we need to bring more to bear on this problem than has been brought to bear so far. And I believe that information is there. Because, and the other thing I'd like to say is that this has been presented as a tsunami affecting Barbados, but this has been a very slow tsunami. There are many of us who have been raising these concerns for multiple years.
Yep.
So when David says we can't kick the can down the road anymore, I would have said we can't kick the can down the road anymore, because we have been kicking the can down the road for a long time. And we cannot ignore the fact that the dramatic change to the non-contributory pension had an impact. I don't really understand the rules for a non-contributory pension. That doesn't seem to be accountable to the public. But I suspect that an attractive non-contributory pension gives the perhaps false impression to many self-employed that if they don't contribute to national insurance, they'll get a non-contrib pension. And you know what? It's not a bad pension. So let me sit on the sidelines and pretend that I don't have a job, and I'll still get a pension. If this is not true, and there are rules that stop this happening, then now is the time for the government to speak up very clearly and explain that the non-contributory pension will not be given, no matter how many votes it attracts, will not be given to people who could have and should have contributed. So we can't divorce these things. It has an impact on national insurance. I don't know how much this is about people dropping out of contributing, but we need to figure that out. We need to solve the problem of why have so many people dropped out of being contributors. And how do we, even if they hadn't dropped up, how do we attract in the ones that are not?
Charles has a question.
Yeah.
There are two comments here. Is this self-employed debate a red herring? They don't contribute. They're not entitled to benefits. What is the problem here? Do we want the self-employed to fund other people's benefits? That's one question. This is
Of
another.
course.
There's another comment here, and I want you to take the two of them together, and then we transition to three. This is not a question, but more of a statement. People are not going to get on board with contributing to a fund which is mismanaged. Before asking people to get on board, the root problem of mismanagement has to be addressed.
Absolutely, I did. You're absolutely right. Unless we regain confidence in the fund, we will never get self-employed people to contribute. But do we want them to contribute to pay other people's benefits? Of course we do. This is essentially a pay-as-you-go scheme. Okay, we need current contributors to pay current pensioners. And part of the problem is what Derek has reported on, called the dependency ratio. When we had 5 contributors for every pensioner, then the pay-as-you-go rate, basically if we're going to pay a 60% pension, this is very crude, 60% pension, and we have 5 people contributing for every one, then they can contribute 12%, 5 12s or 60. If we only have 3 people contributing for every pensioner, then we need 20%, 3 20s or 60. And when it becomes 2 people, it becomes 30%. That's really crude, okay? Derek does a lot of numbers to work to determine that it's not 30%, it's 30.2 or 28.1. But crudely speaking, that's how you can get a clear indication. So we need to keep the contributors high. Now, in an aging population, that is an inescapable fact that the ratio will go down. And the only way to keep that ratio stable is to move the barrier between those that work and those that retire by moving the retirement age. So we could move the retirement age so that we always keep that ratio at a number that fixes the contribution, but is that acceptable? Now, all of that may become a moot point because a country is supported by its productive employees. And the question is, are we moving into a world where less people are working and more people are retired? And if so, how are we in fact going to fund society? That's a deep question, and I hope we can get back to it maybe, but fundamental at the minute is that we get our contributors up. And you're right, David, integral to that is confidence.
Mm-hmm. Derek Hickson, your thought.
One other point. Me?
Yes, Derek Osborne, come back and then.
Sorry. Yeah, so Charles mentioned the self-employed, and I agree totally. The one thing we also have to fix, though, is the generosity of the pension to short service. Mm-hmm. So a self-employed person who pays for 10 years and gets their foot in the door gets at least minimum pension, but really hasn't paid probably for a quarter of it, right? So right now, the formula is, with eligibility, is tens of contributions, 500 weeks. So once you're in the door, and you could be 35 when you're in the door, and pay no more for 30 years, you're guaranteed minimum pension. And that's part of the problem, right? So what we need is not only them to contribute, but to contribute for their whole career.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now to Gregory Hinkson.
Yeah, thanks, David. I really want to go back to a point that Charles made. And I think to a certain extent, his point was that we need to get people to regain confidence within the NIS. And the discussion I had with Derek before we started this afternoon is that this conversation has been going on for quite a while. And as Charles said, if you read the reports going back from the 11 for 12 report, what are we talking? The things that we're talking about today are the same things that we talked about, looking at the 13th report. And one of the questions that we need to ask, David, is this. We talked about pension reform in 2002, And we're talking about pension reform again in 2022. And in 2002, we said at the point in time, these things are going to fix NIS, and we will be looking down the road and pension, the next time we discuss pension reform or adjustments to pension, maybe around this time. But let's look back, David, at what we said in 2002 versus where we are right now. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So I've just pulled 3 elements out of the 12th actuarial report, 13th actuarial report. So the 13th actuarial report essentially say that the projections, remember the 13th actuarial report was done in 2008, and it said that in 2020, the population would be $295,000 persons. The actual 17th report at 2020, and Derek, you can check your numbers, it is now saying that the 2020 population is 271. So in actual fact, between what we projected and now, our numbers have gone down 24,000. And if you spread that across the 3 different main buckets, those 0 to 17 or 0 to 16, your working age population and your older population, you can actually see the point that Charles made earlier. The numbers of persons within the working system have actually gone down. So your contributors, which make up a significant component of that, has gone down. The next element that we talked about, going back again to the 13th report, is that your total expenditure would have exceeded contributions when? In 2022, this year. That's what that original report said. The 15th report essentially reported that we breached that in 2014. So that is 8 years earlier than we projected. So in actual fact, from 2014, based on some final adjustments, we've had to dip into investment income in order to meet our benefits payments. Now let's look at reserves. Let's look at the reserves. In the 13th actuarial report, we projected that in 2020, our reserves would be approximately 6.9 billion. And there, your report would have gone 2018, 2020, 2020, 2028. And if you extrapolate between 2018 and 2028, that's where I get my 6.9 billion. Our actual reserves as at 2020 was 3.8 billion. So even if you adjust for your debt restructuring, we're still approximately 40% lower than where we projected. We're still 40% lower than where we projected. So in the final analysis, when you actually look at what we were expecting to achieve in pension reform and what we've actually achieved, the fund has done worse than the most pessimistic element going back to that report that was done at the end of 2005. So we hear issues like mismanagement, we hear all kinds of issues, but I think we need to put the facts on the table. We talk about economic climate that would have occurred within the last 20 years. And if you actually think about it, within 5 years of pension reform, we were actually impacted by the 2008 financial crisis. And remember what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. For us, it took us between 2008 to 2012, 2013, in order to even try to recover. And we had years of negative growth. So the point I'm making, David, is that we saw this coming down the road, but unfortunately, we did not make any adjustments based on changes that would have taken place. And where we are right now, going back to the question, what it is that we want to achieve. What it is that we want to achieve. Is it the same objectives that we had back in pension reform in 2002? Do we want to give each person who reached retirement age what Derek talks about, a minimum level of pension regardless of their income level? How do we bring those self-employed persons within the system in order to get them contributing. But as Charles said, the challenge would be, and if you look back at the 2008 report, the 2008 report basically said within a couple years after pension reform, you actually started seeing that there was a level of non-compliance. And at that particular point in time, persons deliberately or otherwise found a way not to comply with the system. And the challenge we have now is that if you have not if you haven't contributed for the last 20 years, and you say to them, you're 40 now or 42 now, and I want you now to contribute on a pay-as-you-go system, my contribution is going first and foremost in order to pay benefits to the persons within the system. And I may ask myself, Pops, it's like, I'm not going to make enough contributions in order to get the benefit. And by the way, that benefit is also going to be reducing. So there's no incentive for me in order to contribute to the system. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we really want to achieve in this new pension reform exercise that we are undertaking? Has the goals changed from pension reform back in 2002? And there are a number of discussion points that have been raised this afternoon, David. And I think to a certain extent, looking at the number of participants that we have on board, I would certainly welcome the opportunity to hear from some of those participants in some of the issues that have been put in relation to pension reform.
Is there any reaction from either of the other panelists?
David, certainly, I thought Gregory brought out very nicely how these things were projected and have changed over the last 10 years. And I want to say
20 years. Yeah.
But my main point that I'm saying is, we've had a board of NIS who don't have to wait on a 3-year actuarial report.
Mm-hmm.
They know they were projected to have 130,000 contributors in a given year. And they must at least, but even without audited, we say here they still have financial reports. They must have known the number of contributors had fallen. Did they not notice any of these misses to the projections over the years? Where was the Board of National Insurance? So I don't care. The chairman can sit there and tell me he has a very well qualified board. And I know you can't hold the current board responsible for the previous board, but a lot of the current board has been on there now for nearly 5 years. Where were they that they failed to realize? Did they not know that restructuring had taken $1 billion out of the fund? So there's no path. There's no path for the Board of National Insurance. I'm sorry. And there are going to be no new contributors until they feel that there is a board that is held accountable.
And that, for many people, is a central issue in this discussion. They have actually gone past all of the proposals and ideas that are before them. And they're saying, look, you got to keep government's hands off of our money. They've been saying that repeatedly. And the question therefore arises as to what can be put in place that can bring a greater sense of accountability and responsibility to those who are put in charge of this money. People who sit on boards in private companies are said to have a fiduciary responsibility and legal responsibilities. But this does not apply to something as important as the NIS board. Your thoughts, and I also want to encourage the comments from the members of who are participants here this evening. I've seen one hand go up. I think it's a Baronia. I want to come to you as quickly as possible. So from the panelists, your thoughts on this particular challenge.
David, there are two issues that I want to, if people are not aware, the National Insurance Board is in fact the only public sector board where the private sector has the right to nominate 2 directors. So we, I think, could say we're all from the private sector. This is the only board we've had the right to have 2 directors, and we have always appointed 2 directors. Where were they and where were we in holding them accountable? And I think that, and similarly, Labour has two directors. So it's the only board that's been set up that way, where non-government didn't have the right to appoint the whole board. And we would have said that's really good. But I suspect both the private sector and Labour have fallen down by not holding our representatives to account.
But what's the way forward? What's the way forward?
So the way forward is to hold them to account. They must report to us annually, and they must listen to their constituents as to what are the matters that concern them. How can you represent people that you never listen to and you never meet with?
By what mechanism do you hold them to account?
Well, you see, it's part of how they're appointed, and this is where it's gone wrong. The legislation says that the private sector appoints two people, but from back when national insurance was established, there was no private sector organization. And in fact, the way it became the practice that the Barbados Employers and Confederation appointed one, and the Hotel Association appointed one. Certainly back when I was chairman of the BPSA, we asked those 2 members to come and account to us for why there had been no audit and for what was going on. Initially, both refused, and then one came, but one refused to come and claimed that I have been appointed by the BHTA. You have no jurisdiction to ask me to report to you. So there has been a breakdown. Last time there was a pension reform, the private sector formed a committee to make recommendations, and the private sector representative refused to meet with the private sector to hear their recommendations. But he got knighted for it, so that's okay.
David, if I can jump in here, and this is an issue that has been engaged me for quite a while, and this matter of how do you hold people accountable, and I think going back to pension reform and the discussion that is going on right here, the chairman, deputy chairman of the NIS, the CEO of the NIS, held 3 meetings last week. 3 meetings last week in order to raise this matter of pension reform. And I'm suggesting that what we need to do is incorporate within legislation, and we're going to talk about the whole issue of audited accounts shortly, but incorporate within the NIS legislation a requirement that the board do a town hall meeting, just like how they would have done for pension reform, every single year once the time for the audited accounts would have been passed. So therefore, whether you have 5 people attending because nobody else really too keen about it, but essentially it is written within legislation that they need to do that. Every year they need to come. They can hold 1 town hall meeting or 3 town hall meetings, or however long, it doesn't matter, in order to listen, hear the issues, and also to report on their stewardship, just like how directors would normally do on an annual meeting for a company. The more critical issue though, David, and which is raising the matter that everybody has raised about mismanagement, is the whole issue of the investment. And I'm suggesting a different model for that. I'm suggesting that what can apply is that you can set up an independent investment committee made up of professionals, so representative from the Barbados Private Sector Agency, representative from ICAB, representative from the Barbados Association of Retired Persons. And that committee, the board has limited veto powers on the decisions made by that committee, unless it does not meet certain requirements. And I guess persons who are bigger brains than me can then determine under what circumstances would the board veto a decision that has been made by independent persons on an investment committee. So therefore, that gets away from the whole notion that an investment decision may be made for other than investment reasons, either for or against, because you could have situations where an investment committee says yes and the board says no. Equally, you can have a decision where the investment committee says no and the board says yes. So therefore, the board has limited veto power in relation to that investment decision, unless it is under very specific circumstances. So we need to separate the investment issues from the other areas that the board would be responsible for, because the board has to deal with other governance issues. The board have to deal with staffing matters, all of those other matters that would be in the purview of the board. But this whole issue in relation to the investments, then separate that out from the specific board, have an independent grouping, deal with that. And more importantly, just like how you see at most of the major investment firms, then they disclose. The board has agreed to make this particular investment. And you have a press release coming out of that. So everybody knows that the board, that the national insurance has made that kind of investment. So that is actually, in my opinion, going to then reduce this whole issue about decisions being made for reasons other than pure investment decisions.
But Derek Osborne, you have been an actuary not only to NIS schemes in Barbados, but elsewhere in the region. Has anybody else sought to tackle this problem?
Well, I think people try to tackle the problem, but nobody has really changed the way the boards are appointed and what the role of the board is. There's only one country I can think of right now where the board is truly tripartite, that the labor plus the employers, and that's Grenada, is 2 and 2, and the government is 3. So they can actually vote down a government directive or the 3 from the government who want to vote in favor of something. So I love the points, I love the ideas, and good governance really matters. Good governance really matters. The challenge with NIS for the last 15, 20 years is that the investment policy said maximum government debt of, I think, is 50%, and it went over consistently, right, for many, many years. And so that's a challenge. And so hopefully, the ideas are great, and I think they're very doable. In having independent, at least a chairman for investment committee, or even the whole committee, and having a board that its role is redefined. So the tripartite nature of the board is traditional, right? But for the most part, it's probably more of a policy thinking behind the board as opposed to a leadership, in terms of overseeing a big operation that's really critical. And so we have to consider whether the tripartite board is what we still need, whether we need tripartite board for policy, a strong business type management board for administration, and as Gregory mentioned, investment committee that's independent. So they're all good options.
This person wants to know whether the NIS has an internal audit department and what have their reports indicated and advised. Another says they have a question for the actuary. How can we have confidence in the data provided by the NIS when the NIS can't meet the requirements to pass an audit and produce audited financial statements for 10 years? I am told, says the writer.
So great question for me. But the first one about the internal audit department, I think the answer is yes. There's an internal audit department. But that probably more deals with operational activities and ensuring that the benefits are at the right amount and paid to the right person and so on. In terms of our work in projecting the fund, and you're all accountants, so the starting point is the reserves as of a certain date. And we use a cash basis this time around investment listing is pretty good. It's reliable, we trust it. So we use investments plus cash in the bank as our starting point for reserve. The investment income, because investments are good, investment income is pretty reliable. The benefits are pretty much all cash, as are the admin costs all cash, except for depreciation. So the only other item we have to worry about is contribution income. And so we went with a cash base for the most part. NIS does accruals, and they do accruals based on employers that are open for business. And so the numbers there probably do exceed what actually is collected. And so we try to go down to a cash basis for the projections for the contribution income. So we believe that we're pretty close on investment income, benefits, and the starting fund is actually conservative. It could be bigger if there's receivables going to be collected. The contributions is the one where there's probably some room, and we think we're pretty close to what we need to be for cash collections prior to COVID. Last year was about 550 million, I think, and this year should be a little bit more year to date.
Charles Herbert, your thoughts?
Yeah. One that's worrying me within that, David, that is a theme that has also come out of the town hall meetings and in what I read in the press. And this seems to be a tacit encouragement of pushing the idea that private sector employers deduct contributions and don't pay them over. And really, what I would like to know is what are the numbers? Because I think that what we have done is created a distrust between employers and employees, which I would like to understand if it really is valid. I certainly am associated with several companies, and I know that national insurance contributions are paid like clockwork. I would like to know what is the delinquency rate and how old are the receivables? What proportion of contributions are not paid over on a timely basis? And is it private sector or is it public sector? Because we know that prior to this administration in 2018, the receivables from the public sector were the biggest problem. So I'd like to substitute some facts for the impressions that are being given to the public, because I believe that this again is part of us eroding the trust that people have in their employer and in the system. And look at how that is tearing the United States of America apart, where the public no longer knows what's true and what isn't true. So we need facts. Derek, I don't know if you have them, but we need them. And I would think it's more administrative than actuarial.
I don't have good information on the receivables. The one challenge is that, so if you think of NIS from an accounting standpoint, an employer who's open for business and submitted a schedule 6 months ago, unless he's closed on the system, will keep generating a receivable, right? And so we're not quite sure exactly where they are. And again, systems matter, and the NIS needs to find
how big is that, Eric? How big is that? How many employers are expected to pay and are not paying? How big is the number? Is it a problem? Is it 5%? Is it 1%? Is it 20%? The public has the feeling certainly that this is like 50% of all employers are corrupt and use their members' money to run their businesses. Right. And nobody wants to step forward and say that that is not true.
Right. And I can't say whether it's true or false either. So, but I think we can work on that next few weeks and get back to the public hopefully soon with some good numbers on that. I'll definitely push for that.
Confidence is critical. There. And I think that this tacit destroying confidence in employers, and I am not saying that you did it, sorry, I'm not accusing you.
No, I got you. Yeah.
But I still feel that by remaining silent when people in the town hall meetings say, and without correcting them and saying, you know what, this isn't really a problem, it lets the lie, if it's a lie, it lets it grow. And I think it is a dangerous one
Mhm.
because it encourages people to, anyway.
And
it
David,
just-
David, we come back to the issue that you raised earlier. And I think we need to circle back to that. When we start to look at these options, and essentially, Derek has actually identified them, and I guess we can spend some time thinking about these options. So the very first one is the increasing the contribution rate, without any significant changes to the benefits. So those benefits remain. We increase the contribution rate in order to then bridge that gap that Derek has talked about. The second one is reducing benefits such that without a change in contribution, you're still supporting this lower benefit level. And your third one, which is being thrown around, is now increasing the national insurance retirement age. So if you look at the contribution rate can technically be adjusted in one or two ways. You can actually raise the rate, which is applicable to everybody, or you can raise the earnings ceiling. The problem with that is that if you raise the earnings ceiling, then you're actually going to be putting that burden on the middle class. So unless you have an adjustment in the lower rate for tax in order to compensate for that higher earnings ceiling, you're actually going to be double taxing someone. So therefore, you have to then determine, do you want this to be equitable across the board? So therefore, everybody actually now make its fair share. You make a point, Derek, earlier that our benefits seem to be fairly generous. And the question is, do we then look to see cut back on benefits? You made a point earlier that approximately a significant amount of persons who receive benefits would be receiving the minimum benefit.
40%.
Yeah, 40% receiving the minimum benefit. So there would be a percentage of those persons who are probably at the top end, but in most cases, they may have other resources. They may have their own private pension plan. They may actually have other resources that they can draw on. And therefore, NIS may not necessarily be a significant component of their overall earnings in retirement.
No, David, no. Mr. Gregory, the minimum. So those are the lower income ones who tend to get or short service, who tend to get bumped up to the minimum.
Right. Yeah. So I understand that, but I'm thinking about those persons who have been contributing at the higher end of the earnings ceiling. So therefore, you are now entitled to a maximum pension.
2,500 and more. Yeah.
Based on the earnings ceiling. So the question is, do we then reduce that rate in relation to that maximum? Because most cases, and I guess we have to do some sort of indication that for those persons, they may actually be receiving other form of income, private pension income. They may actually have. So therefore, they're the ones who may be impacted significantly by this, but it has to be phasing over a long period of time. And then the whole issue about increasing the retirement age, And when you look back at when the retirement age was set at 67, and this is the issue that came out in the town halls, you have your, you basically will be looking to see what is life expectancy. Life expectancy was 67 or thereabout. So therefore, I retire at 65, and therefore, life expectancy is 67. Life expectancy is actually increased fairly significantly over that particular period, and therefore, we have life expectancy now in the 70s or maybe late 70s or early 80s. Somebody asked me that question. I say, to give an indication about life expectancy, all you have to do is take our Sunday newspaper, go back over every Sunday over the last year, look at the average age of the persons who have died, and that give you a good indication of what life expectancy. So as life expectancy is increasing, you may wish to also move this retirement age. When you go back to pension reform, that retirement age was moved over a period of 16 years. So we only got to 67 literally 4 years ago in 2018. So if we're going to be
Interesting.
moving this retirement age again, then we're talking possibly almost a similar time period. So to move it from 67 to 72 along the same basis, when you're doing, so 65 to 67 took 16 years, from 67 to 72, you do the math, how long you will actually need to get there if you use the same mechanism that we did. So the question is, do we need to move that on a much faster basis? So therefore we do it in 10 years to move from 67 to 72. Now, the conversation around this is that there are some persons who at age 72 can still be earning fairly significantly. And, you know, I'm not necessarily would want a 72-year-old surgeon working on me, but I certainly would want a 72-year-old lawyer representing me in court because of the years of experience that that person would bring. So it gives you the flexibility in terms of retiring early and retiring late. So the whole question is, this is something that we need to consider if a person decides I can wait until 72 in order to get my pension. It gives them the flexibility to do that. But the idea is that we have to make it attractive for persons where this is. So therefore, you may have to say, in order to move to 72, it's not this even distribution between 65 and 72 over 67 as a retirement age. I need to make it attractive for you to stay in until 67. I need to make it a disincentive for you in order to retire too early because your reduction. So right now we have this even distribution across from 60 to 67, or even to age 70, from 60 to 70. But we may wish to then change that model in order to say that it's not an even distribution across that. It is a different level of distribution.
Richard Reed wants to know whether we can prepare at least 5 scenarios where we show a way forward to achieve our most desired end. Derek, what do you think?
The short answer is yes. The short answer is yes.
And the answer will be, perhaps, why haven't we done so if we haven't?
Oh, no, we have not done so. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think I used the 2 words tweak and overhaul, right? A tweak would mean NIS looks the same as it does today. You just make 67, 68, or make 60%, 55%, or do little things to the formula to make it a little bit less generous. That's a tweak. An overhaul would be a totally new looks NIS. It could be defined contribution. It could be a second or third pillar. It could be move to full funding. That's extreme. So there are options between those two. Charles?
The question is for both you and Charles would be basically this: based upon what we have seen over time, various actuarial studies that we've seen and where we are today, which one looks more desirable?
But David, I want to just start by, Derek, tell me if I'm right. I mean, I think you report the pay-as-you-go rate going to something like 35% in the 30s, 20, 35, around there.
Yeah, I think so. I'll put it out.
If we don't want our contributions to rise beyond their current level,
24%.
to me, that tells me that out in 2035, we need to be paying roughly 50% of the rate of benefit that we're paying now. I mean, this is not, people have got to get their head around that this is not about a 5% change in benefits. Okay? If in fact we're not going to contribute more, this is about a drastic reduction in benefits. Drastic. It's like having it. It's like instead of paying a 60% pension, we're going to pay a 30 or 40% pension. Okay? So I just don't want people to think that we can do tweaking. There is no tweaking if we are not going to pay a lot more. we're talking of a major change in benefit levels. Okay? And I don't think the population has yet woken up to the fact that this can't be fixed by the government putting back $1 billion or putting back $9 million from Four Seasons or improving in the governance of NIS. None of those things can fix it. I mean, you can also ask Derek, I mean, demographics of the country is one of the easier things to project. We know how many people are going to be age 60 in 10 years' time because they're age 50 now.
Oh, right.
Except for a few that die. Demographics is very, very predictable.
Mhm.
And I think the other point that I don't think has come across or people have glossed over it. I know that when I go into a store, I mean, take myself, I'm 67. I'm not an actuary anymore. I've retired, but I'm growing lettuce. And yes, I'm not earning as much as I earned as an actuary. And I think people will want to still change their profession somewhere in their 60s, but it doesn't mean that they're going to go home and be idle. Nobody can be idle for 30 years. Because the other misquoted statistics, Derek, and I'd ask you if you could comment on this to the others, is we keep quoting the expectation of life from birth. But that because someone born on average lives to age 76, let's say, that doesn't mean that if somebody reaches 67, that they're on average going to only live 10 years. By the time you take out the people who died before 67, the expectation of life at 67 is probably well into the 80s.
So
we keep quoting, I think, the wrong number and not really saying how long are people expected to be on pension. And I think if people realize, and this is another problem, if I said to most people in the audience, do you accept that on average, people are living 10 years longer than their parents? People would probably say yes. If I said to you, do you accept that you will live on probably 10 years longer than your parents? Most of us will say no, because we have an inherent human ability to be very conscious of our mortality and to think that we're not going to live long. And we have to do quite a selling job on people for them to understand just how long they're going to live.
Mm-hmm.
The world has changed and it's continuing to change. And I don't think we've sold that statistic and that understanding to the population.
Just for good point, Charles. So what we assume at around 2020 for females, 18.2 years. That's what? That's 83. And for males, 15.4. So that's 80. No, sorry. 85 for females. 85. Mm-hmm. My math is about at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, at 7 o'clock. And 15 for males after 67. Right. 82. Yeah.
This question is, to what extent has government been required to pay severance for companies which have declared bankruptcy only to restart later without repaying the funds used for severance?
So the short answer is that, well, the government doesn't pay severance. The NIS has a severance fund, manages a severance fund. And the severance fund, we say is not working well. It is growing, even though there's been recession after recession and companies are closing. A lot of money is paid. So the way it works, the employer pays the whole severance. And when they do that, the severance fund gives them back a 25% rebate.
Supposed to.
Well,
often it doesn't, Derek. I can tell you from experience, these things are hard to claim, and part of the reason it's not working is because they don't like to pay out money.
The fund is loaded. The severance fund is loaded. The tribunals, I understand, take a long time. I don't know why. It takes forever for the tribunals, but the fund has money. Yeah. So again,
Under,
But,
under,
the questioner is still right, David. There are cases where people should pay back, and it would seem to us from the distance that we sit that they don't. It would seem to us that there are some employers who don't pay over contributions. You know, my understanding as a company director is that the national insurance law makes unpaid contributions in liability, personal liability to directors of the company. That's one of the most draconian laws that there is. But we, like everything else in Barbados, we have never applied the law. We haven't made people afraid to not pay contributions, but we have the laws. And we have the teeth.
Yeah, the teeth are there. Yeah.
I'd just
I
like to
don't know why.
interject. We
I
have
don't know
two
why you
people
don't
who have raised their hands and want to ask a question. So I'm going to unmute Petra Bostic.
sure, go ahead.
Petra, you can go ahead and speak.
I'm now seeing some hands as well. Petra?
He's on mute.
You're still on mute.
Still on mute.
Still muted. Well, in the meantime, why not let's go to the other person, Elizabeth Stout-Brathwaite. Is that person there? Both seem to be having issues.
Does the moderator have to unmute them?
I don't think so. Let me try and see if I can do so. I don't have that off.
Okay, I'm seeing Elizabeth Stout-Brathwaite is unmuted.
That was an error. I can't get it off. I don't know why it's happening.
Oh,
Okay.
so, okay,
You don't want to speak.
No, sir.
okay.
So that brings us to the other person, but she's not able to get through. Let me put a question to you in the meantime from somebody else here, one of the attendees. Now, we are speaking of reducing benefits from the NIS and speaking about the existence of private pension funds. However, private pension funds are double taxed, and this issue needs to be addressed. There is no incentive to put funds in a private pension. Response?
Absolutely, David. The NIS, and I'm sure Derek will back me on this, is meant that people have three pillars to rely on for their pension. Social Security is only one. Private pension saving is the second. And the third is the kind of saving that we all hopefully build up in equity during our working lifetime, like paying off our mortgage and so on. The previous government cut the legs from under private pension funds when it made the contributions not deductible. Essentially, it was an IMF proposal, but we implemented only 50% of the proposal. And the idea, which I think was right in the IMF, was that higher paid earners therefore got a bigger incentive to save for their pension because they saved at a higher marginal tax rate, and lower earners got less of an incentive. And the suggestion from the IMF was that it stopped being a deductible before tax, and you started getting a pension, a tax credit, where everyone would get the same level of tax credit. So whether you were a low earner or a high earner. And I think that made a lot of sense, but we only 50% implemented the proposal, and that was a huge disincentive to private pension saving.
Yeah, David, I fully support that. And I think to a certain extent, this whole issue of NIS reform has to be taken in the context of wider pension reform. Now, later on this year, my understanding is that there's going to be another discussion. And this is the discussion in regarding the reform of the public sector pension. And that's a whole other discussion that is going to be whole part of this. But you know, the real point that Charles Sebastian made, if we're going to be suggesting that we're now looking at the whole matter of pensions in a broad context, we got to address the whole issue of the occupation pension benefits component, and the point that is being made, because as the person rightly said, you actually pay tax on both ends. You actually pay tax because you do not get this benefit any longer. But if you do receive a pension from a private pension plan, you actually pay tax when you actually receive that in your hand, which I think is grossly unfair. And essentially, there's no incentive for entities in order to establish a pension plan for their particular employees.
David, there's another issue which will go down well with, or will be well understood by the audience. Where an employer has a defined benefit pension scheme and their expense is reported through IAS 19. Probably a bad word for younger accountants, but the older ones will have been that road. If where you have a harmonized scheme, basically an employer is saying, I want my employee to get a 2/3 pension, but I contribute to national insurance. So part of that pension will come from national insurance and part will come from the private pension plan, and together they will add to 2/3. Now, for their employees that are under the ceiling, this is meant that if national insurance is going to pay 60%, then the employer is only going to have to top it up by 6 or 7%. If the national insurance benefit and that's a little bit of an overstatement because national insurance never quite gets to 60, but it makes my point. If the national insurance benefit is cut from 60 to 50, the private pension plan goes from 6 to 16. So that's if we only go from 60 to 50. If we go from 60 to 40, it goes from 6 to 26. And the liability hit to that private pension plan is going to be enormous. And it's all going to be accounted for as an expense in the year in which it occurs. So we have got to be very, very careful that what we do to national insurance doesn't in fact bankrupt private sector employers. That's one point. The second point is for public sector employees, which are probably 25 to 30,000 of the 110 contributors. So a very sizable chunk. Everybody left in the public services now is abated, which means their national insurance pension gets deducted from their government pension. So there are a few technical issues, but by and large, if we cut their NIS pension, it's just going to be picked up by government. So what we will have done is remove a benefit to which they now pay half of the contribution and thrown it back into the pot of public sector pensions where it's entirely paid for by the taxpayer. So we will have actually, for a huge chunk of people, stopped them contributing for a part of their pension. So these are the interrelated issues which will have to be considered when we actually come up with a solution. We can't leave the public sector scheme unchanged. We can't leave the private sector scheme unchanged. But this requires understanding, because while national insurance does not have an employer-employee relationship with its contributors, employers do. And they can't just willy-nilly change their benefits.
Derek, your thoughts on what has been said here?
Yeah, no, I agree with Charles' mathematics and the principles that he's espoused. I think Greg, you mentioned earlier, we have to find a way to get Barbados to agree on a whole retirement system and where the money comes from. How much from NIS, how much from private pension plans, and how much from own personal savings. And hopefully we can find a way to the taxation issue. Again, the private sector has been invited to suggest ways to find a solution for either the taxation or to amend the Occupational Pensions Act. And so hopefully that comes on the table, when discussions start. And we find a good solution that blends the NIS with the private pensions and personal savings.
Gregory and Charles, have you given any thought to what possible incentives there could be for the private pension plans?
Look, we need to implement the tax change. But, by and large, most private pension plans are now defined contribution plans. But for most of them, employees, because there's no deduction, don't make additional contributions. There are many defined contribution plans where the employer says, if you put in an extra 1%, we'll match it and put in 1%. So basically, by putting in $1, you get $2.
Right.
And nonetheless, people generally don't do it because of this resentment that their $1 is not going to be tax deductible.
In addition to David, in addition to that, if you look at places like Bermuda, Cayman, and to a certain extent, a couple other islands, one of the things that they've done is made occupation pensions in its general term mandatory for everyone. We have not done that in Barbados. And if we are going to be looking at this whole issue of total pension reform, we may have to give consideration of that. So for instance, in some of those jurisdictions, what you typically find is that there are entities who actually, because of your unit cost being dropped, you're able to provide that benefit. You may decide that you would want to match contributions, but at least persons are actually saving for their retirement. Which now brings us to another important element, and we've touched on it before, which is education. And I think to a certain extent, we have to start educating persons. The Financial Literacy Bureau that had been developed is a starting point, but we have to get persons in primary school, in secondary school, even in university and colleges to really understand this whole issue of saving and investment. If you think about the point that Charles made, I actually have to say to persons, tell me an investment where you can get 100% return, 100% return with no risk. So if you're putting in $1 and your employer is putting in $1, that's actually about $2, and that's 100% return immediately over a period of time. And persons don't typically or understand that until you really show over a period of time how this matching contribution made by your employer, where you have not, literally you don't have to do anything, can actually build to a fairly significant amount over a period of time. But that takes education. The whole issue of national insurance, this jingle, which has been going on now forever, national insurance being a lifeline, that has to change. We now need to take a different approach for persons to understand what national insurance is, the benefit of national insurance, and why it makes sense in order to then contribute. And I'm certain people in national insurance have to then think about how do you get to those persons. So you have to go to the fish market, you have to go to the persons within, the vendors where they are, to actually start to explain this to them and explain this to them in a language that they can understand the benefits of savings. And unfortunately, we missed that opportunity over the last 20 years. And now to try to convince a person who may be 40 or 42 or 45 that you now need to start saving for, your retirement. And by the way, we're going to move your retirement age, which is now 67 to something immediate higher. It is going to be a very, very difficult sell in order to do that. And the problem that we're going to encounter if we start to tinkle with this contribution rate, is the higher you make that contribution rate, the greater incentive is there for non-compliance. And I think, Derek's report, I think in 2008, basically said we increased the contribution rate, and within the first 2 actuarial reports, we saw this whole issue of non-compliance showing up at that particular point in time. So that's another issue that we're going to have to address.
There are some bits of information that people are seeking here. One is, do expats or non-nationals who come to Barbados to work also pay NIS?
Short answer is yes. Most of them.
Okay. What impact does increasing the retirement age have on sickness benefits based on the projections?
Sickness benefit is a very, very small component of NIS, and it really would not change. So even if we think about older folks getting sick more often, that really wouldn't move the needle in terms of extra costs.
Does the civil service pay NIS at the same rate as persons in the private sector?
They pay slightly less, but they don't qualify for sickness benefit because government just gives them full salary for how many ever weeks the employment
severance,
terms.
and they don't qualify for severance.
No severance, right? They pay 0.5%, so the government doesn't pay for severance. Well,
Right.
no, for the pensionable civil servants, pensionable civil servants pay less than the casual non-pensionable ones. Non-pensionable pay same as private.
Okay, do we have Petra Bostic with us? I think she was trying to raise a question earlier. Is that still your desire, Petra? Just unmute. The difficulty.
Oh no, David, sorry, you can go ahead.
Okay. This
All right,
person
team.
says, I had a private pension fund taxed at source from just after I started working. After 16 plus years, CLICO collapsed. And now I'm getting pennies on the dollar from government, plus it is taxed again.
And I would like to ask that person, and I'd like to ask you, David, or have any of the CLICO directors been held to account? We talk about accountability, and here we've had in Barbados the biggest failure in our lifetime that has cost the government. Does anybody even know who they are and what account they have been held to? Because I assure you, that was not a failure because of a financial event. It was a failure of governance.
So this person,
we keep sweeping these things under the carpet, but in Barbados, we have allowed catastrophes to happen time and time again. I'm sure some of the audience will be too young to remember trade confirmers. There was not one single director held accountable, and members of the public lost their entire savings. CLICO has been similar. Who is to blame? And will the same thing happen at National Insurance? We don't hold anybody.
Who will say that national insurance is on a similar trajectory.
Well, National Insurance is different. You know, I really think it's time for us to tell the public that this has not happened because of government's mismanagement of the fund, and it's not happened because the government has taken their money. I mean, that narrative it just isn't true. And somebody other than Derek, because they think that he is conflicted in some way, needs to tell the public that that is just not the main reason for why we're where we are.
Explain it in more detail, therefore. Be that somebody.
Well, the truth is it's demographic, David. It's partly because, as we've been saying tonight, we have kicked the can down the road for many years. The trends that have caused us to reach this point have been happening for a while. Yes, the write-off of $1.3 billion, but we knew that happened 5 years ago. Suddenly, today, it's a catastrophe. We knew that happened.
Reconcile that with the amount of NIS funds that were put into government paper, which actuarial reviews warned against time and again.
Yeah, you're right, and that certainly is an issue. I mean, on you know, I worry that any change in investment policy is going to have very little effect at a time that a fund is declining. There are no monies to invest.
Mhm.
In fact, there'll be a little bit of maturities for a short time that are more than we need to pay benefits. But the truth is, unless we actually sold government bonds,
Right. Right.
which is a very, let's face it, government can't get anybody to buy their new issues. I think we're wasting time talking about investment policy. For me, the one thing I would say for sure is I wouldn't be supporting raising contributions to build a bigger fund. I think if we look back at hindsight, we would have been better off having a pay-as-you-go scheme and letting people invest the money that they didn't contribute and only paying what it was needed to pay benefits. I think this whole building of a fund created a risk that we perhaps didn't anticipate or didn't deal with.
And Charles, I would support you on that because, you know, if you think about the points that Derek has raised, even if you raise contribution rates now, unless you raise them fairly significantly, most of that contribution is actually going to meet that gap that he's actually identified. So therefore, there is, for me, I don't think there is going to be any fund that is actually going to be necessary in order to build up. Now, one of the points that I heard being repeated again, and I think this was said by the deputy chairman, is that the fund has been earning, and let's assume 8% or 6% or whatever the number is. But the problem is that if you think about investment income and very, very simple for persons who may not necessarily be accounting in nature. If I invest, and I'm using an equity, for instance, if I invest in an equity, $100 in equity right now, and at the end of the year, the value of that equity is $105, I've made a 5% return. Let's assume on top of that, I got a 3% dividend, that's an 8% return. But the problem is, if I need 6% in expenses, that 3%, that 8% return is not going to help me because I still need to fill that gap between the $3 in actual cash income I've received and the $6 in expense that I need to pay out. So therefore, I have to then reduce the value of that investment by $3 in order to meet that gap. So the whole issue of changing your investment strategy nowadays or today is going to have, in my view, very little impact on the fund itself because you're no longer building up a fund. When I go back to the point that I made earlier, one of the things back in pension reform, when we actually look at what our reserves were likely to be, one of the questions that was asked, come 2022, when you actually now go through this inflection point where we actually need our investment income, what is the level of fund that I need to generate cash income in order to meet that gap when I add it to contribution income? But we're nowhere near there. So therefore, the challenge that we're going to have is how do we fill that gap? And I honestly don't think that gap can actually be filled exclusively from investments because we're going to be we've already started drawing down the fund, and that fund is going to continue to draw down. Increased contribution may stop the slowdown of that reduction, but inevitably, as more persons retire, and if you look at the demographic profile, and if you look at the statistical information coming out of the Barbados Statistical Service on the 2010 census, the largest component of your population, I think it accounts for approximately 30% in 2010, was that person or those persons between age 40 and age 60. Those persons 20 years later, we're there. They're 20 years older. So that is now you're into either I'm in retirement or I'm approaching retirement. So that is the challenge that we're going to see when we talk about this whole issue of investment strategy or changing your investment philosophy, because it is not going to address this demographic issues that is on us right now.
We have just about another half hour or so, and quite a number of comments and or questions in here.
Sorry, David, I'd just like to, just one person carrying on from what Gregory was saying, someone has made the point that they don't imagine Barbados is the only country in the world with an aging population and decline in population growth. Are there any best practices we can model? So maybe Derek or Charles?
I'll let
I'll go
Derek
first.
go first.
I'll be brief. So every country is battling this. You know, I mean, fertility rates have come down across the world. Barbados was faster than most in the 60s and 70s, and we're all living longer across the world. Right? So it's a natural progression of smaller families be living longer. Some countries have done tweaks so far. Some have done overhauls. In the Caribbean, most of it has just been increasing the age, increasing the contribution rate, and some reduction in benefits as Barbados would have done 18 years ago. Some countries have gone, Chile went back in the 80s to a totally different system. They came back to DB. European have tried different things. There are options, but we have to find one that fits Barbados. And I think Charles and other people have read enough about these things, and we can put our heads together and find one that fits Barbados for a while. But the economy has to work. Any system we use, right? If you're going to invest in Barbados and depend on workers to help fund any system, the economy has to be creating additional jobs and higher paying jobs.
But that's a big unknown.
But
big
David,
Right.
can I just draw out one more thing from Derek? In most of these developed countries, what is their target benefit? Part of our problem is in Barbados,
Good
we have
point.
a security scheme with a 60% benefit.
Right.
Most of the developed world target somewhere between 30 and 40.
Right.
So yes, they have the same problem, but the size of the problem is different because they also have other pillars that make up people's pension. The problem in Barbados is we essentially, for most people, have one pillar. We put all of our eggs in one basket. And I can tell you that when we reformed in 2003, the private sector warned against that. We wrote a paper making suggestions, and we were told by government that it didn't meet their top 10 considerations because it only came from one person, the private sector. So,
David, if I can, sorry, Charles, I'm not sure if you're finished.
yeah, no, I've never finished.
The whole issue, David, in the point that you raised, and this going back to this whole issue of demographic, there's an element that is outside of the purview of the national insurance, and this has to do with immigration policy. So therefore, if we're seeing what we're observing, so for instance, nurses from Ghana, agricultural workers from Guyana, and I'm just using this as an example, not necessary, construction workers from China, the welcome stampers. And again, the question is whether they make the contribution. So therefore, and that's policy in terms of doing that. The unfortunate thing that we see, and I can just go from anecdotal evidence here, is that is being obscured by the movement of young persons out of Barbados. I have a friend who have 5 kids. 3 of them are actually studied in Canada, and they're now moved to Canada on a full-time basis. The 4th is going to study in Canada shortly. And if you actually now read the census information from Canada for 2020, which was published, I think, in May this year, what they've indicated, and if you go back to actually 1996, when Canada was actually looking at pension reform, their demographics was very similar to Barbados. But there was a telling statistic that I saw. The first time in the last 40 years is that the level of persons over age 65 have actually dropped below 25%. So what is actually happening is that, and one of the reasons for that, and anybody who have gone to Canada over the last 20 or 30 years, and especially in and around the Toronto area, would actually fact see that there is a distinct change that would have taken place visually in relation to the demographic profile. And what is happening is that our young people are addressing the demographic issues in Canada to our detriment. And those are the persons that we are looking to in order to fill that working age population in order to address this whole issue of my contribution ratio. But that's something that is outside of the purview of the national insurance. That has to be government policy. What does our immigration policy look like? But more importantly, what can we do as a country to make it attractive for our young persons to stay here instead of jetting off to some other country?
This person asks, would encouraging short-term expats who pay, but then would not be entitled to contributions, help to build the fund?
That's the BVI principle. That's what the BVI has one of the most well-funded social security schemes in the region. And basically, if you don't stay, if you're not on the scheme for
10 years,
then you get nothing. You forfeit your contributions and all contributions, and they make sure that nobody gets work permits for
longer than 10 years.
And in their case, I think something like 20% of their workforce are on, right. So they get a lot of people contributing who will never get benefits. I don't think we can achieve that.
Yeah, but Charles, I would also add to that. One of the biggest difference, and I think to a certain extent, you saw it following the hurricane of 2017 versus, let's say, for instance, Grenada and Ivan in 2004, the bulk of their investment is in the international market. So in actual fact, the impact for them in relation to an event domestically is very little impact whatsoever on the fund. And that's certainly something, and Derek, I think you would have done the actuarial report for Grenada following, I think, 2005 or 2006. And essentially, because of Hurricane Ivan, we saw a significant decrease in issues, let's say, for instance, of contribution income. Governments cannot necessarily pay on the domestic securities. Companies can no longer make their investments. So therefore, both contribution income as well as investment income was impacted very negatively, because we're talking about an issue of diversification versus this person. So therefore, we talk about diversified portfolio, but within Social Security, if I have a diversified portfolio that is all domestic, then it's like if something happened domestically, it creates a problem. So therefore, I need to have a truly not necessarily a diversified portfolio, a dispersed portfolio where a portion of that, and the larger your portfolio, the larger amount you would want to have dispersed, which is separate and distinct from being within your country. So that's one of the issues that was pushed at the time with pension reform. We needed to have a larger component of the investment portfolio. The challenge is, if you look back to 2004, the amount of your foreign reserves was $1.1 billion. National insurance reserve was $1.2 billion. So therefore, the whole issue of trying to get reserves in order to invest externally created a challenge.
This question, I want to come back to this question here of migration, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting that Canada is very attractive to younger Barbadians. And it comes back to this question of information, because while we have all the anecdotal stories, we are not getting the evidence to show us exactly what is that movement like, going away, coming back, because isn't that important in trying to determine the future of something like NIS?
David, people moving do not create jobs. Jobs create people moving. So we get the cart before the horse. We think that by growing our population, we will grow our economy. If we grow our economy, we will have people staying or coming to take those jobs. But you don't start the process by bringing the people. You start the process by having the jobs. Now, how do we get jobs? The vision of national insurance, and Derek can correct me if I'm wrong, was that National Insurance Fund was going to be used for capital formation to grow our economy. It would invest in businesses and new ventures. We would have hotels owned by national insurance. We would have businesses started up that national insurance bought equity in and supplied capital. That's what happened in most countries with pension fund money. When I worked at the Mutual, and their fund was probably the biggest of pension funds, they were the largest shareholder in every private company in Barbados. So pension fund drives can be used to drive the economy. What we did was we set up a national insurance that sucked all the money out of the private sector pension funds. And then instead of investing it in growing our economy, we lent it all to government for consumption. So we need to grow the economy before we grow the people. And we can only grow the economy now by making the ease of doing business better. And we are making no progress on that.
This question is, are you considering an option to break out sickness, severance, disability, etc. from pensions and allow optional pensions? Is that on the table?
Optional pension. So sickness is a very small cost. Severance is a different fund, right? That's a different fund. In terms of, I've heard about people opting out, being given a choice to opt out over the last few weeks. Not a good idea. Again, we want to broaden the base. That's the principle. The bigger the base, the easier it is for everyone to sustain the NIS. So in terms of, I'm not sure I understand the question. Charles, you get the question? I'm not sure I fully understand.
I suspect they're just saying, can the pension component of national insurance be optional, but keep the other parts of NIS? You keep contributing for sickness and unemployment, but you opt out of pensions.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's possible, but not a good idea. Not a good idea, I don't think, for the overall national system. And I tell you, when COVID hit, a lot of money was paid out to unemployment benefits. People never know when it's their turn to need. And so we have to remember that. We will get old. And while some people have prepared well, many have not. And so having that safety net. But as Charles said earlier, 60% may be too high. 40%, 45% maybe as much as the national system needs to go maybe that far. And then personal and employer-linked pensions kick in the rest.
Yep.
Is there a reason why government doesn't permit NIS to invest more of its money on the international market to get better yields? This is another mechanism to bring in more money.
So it's not the government, it's the central bank. So since before 2008, there was a quarterly limit that NIS used to access and put money overseas. Since 2008, I think, or 9, it's in the report, they've not been given permission to invest money overseas.
But David, I would also point out, there's a level of distrust. Public officers in Barbados, generally, there's a gulf between them and the private sector. I was once told by a director of national insurance that left to them, they would never invest a cent in a private company in Barbados because our governance was too weak. And by and large, that's true. The NIS holds relatively low investments in any listed company in Barbados. It may have changed a bit in recent time, but by and large, there's a feeling that this money will go missing. And it sometimes comes from the public. We heard one person at a town hall saying, why would he didn't want his national insurance money invested in a hotel? But hotels drive our economy. Our population need to feel that hotels can be good investments. And in fact, we invest in them, we will grow our economy and the profits will stay in Barbados.
David, if I can respond to the comment that was made earlier, as Derek would have indicated, the the challenge that we encountered was that the foreign reserves. And one of the suggestions that was made was what is referred to as tier 2 reserves. So therefore, the national insurance, just like how, let's say, for instance, in the case of Trinidad, where you have the National Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which is basically their sovereign wealth fund, that does not count towards their reserve number, because reserves is specifically identified by international agencies what constitute reserves. But it was suggested that the NIS could in actual fact include or maintain its foreign portfolio that, if necessary, could be leveraged if government needed access to foreign currency at the particular point in time. Because all you needed to do with a $500 million or $1 billion portfolio, in order to leverage that, to say, you know what, I go to one of the large investment banks and say, I have a portfolio of $1 billion, I'm looking for a $500 million now. Because over a period of time, the income that will be generated on that particular portfolio, all you got to look historically, and you can use that as a basis of what going forward, your income over a period of time could in actual fact be used in order to repay that a particular amount of the loan. But the challenge that we encountered was that from 2008 or 2009, your foreign reserves were going down. So therefore, it made it almost difficult to impossible in order to access foreign reserves to convert Barbados dollars into foreign currency to invest in the particular portfolio. Now, we can sit back and say, if we had added $100 million to our foreign investment portfolio every year for the last 20 years, and we would have earned the average return that we would have seen on an index. So therefore, you then invest to reflect an index return. What would be the value of that portfolio nowadays? And that was some of the things that we looked at in relation to immediately after pension reform in order to meet this number of $6 or $6.5 billion in reserves in 2020 or 2022 in order to then sustain your benefits payments without impacting your contribution income fairly significantly. But as we know, the rest is history.
In the limited time that we've got now, just about 11 minutes or so, let's come to you, Derek Osborne, and let's explore the way forward. You have put a number of options before the public. You've had this series of town hall meetings. As you seek to zero in on the decisions that have to be made, what's next now? And how especially important is, how could organizations like this one better help you?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, David, for that. So the Prime Minister has given a very tight deadline, and essentially she wants consultations to at least come in within the next week, and then another 2 or 3 weeks at least have a first cut at a solution, right? And so I'll encourage everybody, whether it be ICAB as a group or individual companies and individuals, to submit their suggestions. There's an email address that's available. There's a survey that's going around now. The survey includes some open-ended questions where you can just speak your mind and give your feedback. Each of them will be read and analyzed. And as I said, honestly, there's nothing decided yet. There is no one option over the other. There is no thing that won't be considered. And certainly, this has been a really, really enlightening discussion tonight with Charles and Gregory. And I've made some notes, and these will be considered. And so the time frame is short. The government seems very serious to have something, at least proposed to the population very soon. So all hands need to be on deck, and certainly with social media and ability to get information a lot quicker than it was 18 years ago. Hopefully, we can consider everything. There are plans for some people to come together and a working group and advisory groups from different stakeholders to think about the options and weigh the solutions. And then I'm sure there'll be more discussion again after that group has done their homework.
David,
Yes, Charles.
I put it to you that we have a plane broken down at the airport, and we are going to call a town hall meeting to come up with the ideas on how to fix it. And I honestly couldn't feel more strongly. The town hall meetings may have been good to make people aware of what is going on. But it is not fair to tell the population to come up with the solutions and the ideas. We need to take no more than 10 experts, and we need to lock them in a room and say, you come out when you have 5 varied solutions, and you present those 5 optional solutions to the public of Barbados and let them choose. But asking the population to come up with the solutions is like asking them to fix the plane at the airport. And we are going all around the clock talking about the wrong issues, and we are not focused on what are the select number of viable solutions. And yes, I agree, which one is used must have wide public support, but that is different from asking the public to come up with the solutions.
In a nutshell, what do you see as the viable solutions?
Well, I think there are several. We could go to defined contribution. I like the idea of a flat benefit paid by general taxation with a reduced national insurance benefit cut in half that then gives a progressive benefit. I think there are a number of good solutions that need to be argued out in a select group and then presented to the public and the politicians, the government, in a concise way, and saying, here are a select number of things that could work. Here are the pros and cons. You can have the people who came up with them argue them, or each one champion a different solution just to bring out its features, not because they champion only one. But we need to, the people who work in this area need to present solutions with the pros and cons and let the public choose. But you can't ask the public to come up with the solutions.
Gregory has a question. Why are we rushing the solutions considering the fund is not in immediate danger? How much time would the experts actually need to formulate a comprehensive solution? We either want things done quickly or correctly.
Well, David, and I go back to the point that I made earlier. We have to say to ourselves, what went wrong, or what between what we said that we were going to do in pension reform in 2002 and now, what has actually fact changed, and understand the impact of that particular change. This is not something, all due respect to the Prime Minister and her cabinet, this is not something I think that can be rushed through, because as Charles said, and I alluded to it, any changes we make to NIS is going to have implication on the private pension system, and is also going to have implication on government's reform of the public system. So we need to engage as much stakeholders as possible. And one of the key stakeholders that we need to engage in this, and I think this is a lesson that we've learned between 2008 forward, is that we need to bring on board the opposition, however you define the opposition, because this is a long-term issue. And you don't want them to say that this is not something I support, and when I get back in power, I'm not going to do anything about it because I didn't support it. So therefore, you need to have all of the stakeholders on board. And the way how I would do this is that I would take Charles' starting point. From that, we go to the social partnership. Here are the opportunity. Here is the options being provided to the social partnership. And then we bring those options out to the public, and then there could be debate within the public. There may be tweaking of those particular options. But in the final analysis, these are the major options. But what I would also want to add into that is a degree of flexibility that if you see things within the next 10 years or the next 15 years going different to how you projected, you have the tweak. So within investments, we talked about a strategic investment position and a tactical investment position. So you have a strategic position, but depending on where your economy is at any point in time, you may actually make tactical changes to your strategic. So for instance, you may say, our contribution rate is going to be 6%, but we have the flexibility to move it to 5.5 or 5.75 or 6.25, depending on what the circumstances within that we see. So at that particular point in time, and we also do that on other elements as well. So there must be some flexibility that is brought into or built into the system that make adjustments depending on where things happen. And I guess to certain, if we look back and we had done that and seeing in 2008, things aren't going according to projection, we may have the flexibility to say, we need to make some changes at that particular point. And we need to bring forward the pension age a lot quicker. We need to reduce the benefits. We need to increase the contribution. We need to increase your earnings ceiling. So it needs to have some flexibility in order to make tweaks within that particular period before we come back here in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years in order to look at pension reform tweak.
Thank you very much, Gregory Hinkson, Derek Osborne, and Charles Herbert. And a very special thank you to all the participants, those of you who posed your questions. I hope that this has been a session that has been enlightening for you, and at the same time has put us in a much better position to understand some of the possible solutions out there and the nuances associated with applying those solutions. Over to you, Kathy Ann.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for attending. This is, as David has said, this has certainly been a stimulating discussion. So again, thanks to all the panelists, and thank you, David, for moderating such a lively session. And thank you too to the participants for your attendance. Wishing everyone a very pleasant rest of the evening.